Hey guys, how's it going? This is Mike with another MLS Updater. Today we're going to focus on the three Canadian sides in MLS: Montreal, Toronto, and Vancouver. We're going to be talking about their regular season so far, what to expect going into the playoffs, and for some of them, what we should look at when we come into the following season. We've got Peter Galindo with us today, and we'll be finding out a bit more from him, a Canadian football expert, on what to expect from these three sides. Hi guys, I'm here with Peter Galindo. Peter, how are you doing?
Good, Mike. Yeah, very good. Thanks for having me on the channel. It's a pleasure.
No worries. Thanks for coming on. So to let everyone know, we're going to obviously recapping some of the Canadian sides in MLS so far this season. Why are you a good person for us to be speaking to?
Fair enough. Yeah. So I'm currently a reporter for Sportsnet here in Canada. I also cover the Canadian game for MLSsoccer.com, the official website. So yeah, I guess if you're going to try to find a source for this, you've kind of come directly to it in a way.
Excellent, excellent. So there's been some varying successes this season amongst the three sides. Definitely successes for all. Some things that they're all going to be looking to work on going through this season and next. And let's start with the ones that are getting most of the headlines in Toronto. It was a tricky start and a lot of waiting for their fans, obviously, with the signing of Insigne announced at the beginning of the year. And then obviously now with like Bernadeschi, Crescito coming in. And let's not forget Marc-Anthony Kaye and Richie Laryea. There's been a lot of change in this side. Up until the 15th of July, they were the second worst side in MLS. Only 5 wins and 11 defeats. Since then, they're the third best in the East. It's been a huge turnaround for them, hasn't it? This transfer activity.
100%. Yeah. Even in the games that they've maybe drawn or lost points in, even in the Canadian Championship final, like they've pretty much been in every game. And that's been the big difference, is that when you watch them before all this transfer activity in the summer, especially, as soon as they would concede, you just see them get deflated. They wouldn't really fight their way back into games. And ever since then, now that they've kind of gotten the spine of their team together, you can see the real difference it makes. Obviously, having two of the best players in the league in Bernadeschi and Insigne clearly helps. But all the teams who are competing for MLS Cup do have those one or two difference makers in their side at the end of the day.
Exactly.
So in order for them to progress in this current iteration of the team, they need that spine. And they finally got that back. And even if you go further, like Marc-Anthony Kaye, as you mentioned, I know he's injured, but he'll be a part of the spine going forward. Really, they still have one or two pieces left to fill in. You could probably say they could use another center back going forward beyond this season. But even if you look at it now, yes, it's probably going to be a bit of a tricky test to get into the playoffs, just given some of the points they've dropped against teams they're chasing, but they've given themselves a shot to still make it, provided they continue on the pace they're on, which I believe is just under 2 points a game, which is something they will have to continue to ride for the last 5 games here or so. But it will be tough with them being on the road for those.
Yeah, like you say, three of those games are on the road, and next up they've got Montreal at home. Then it's Atlanta and Orlando away, and into Miami at home. So three of the three sides after that, all in that race, competing for those last sort of 2 or 3 spots in the playoffs. They struggled into Miami. That was one of their defeats recently, and going to Philadelphia at the last game of the season is going to be very difficult, especially if the way Philadelphia are playing and if they're chasing records, the supporters shield as well. You mentioned Marc-Anthony Kaye has come in, who's been a useful part of that midfield and other parts that have been needed. But Jaden Nelson and some of these younger players have really shown up. They had their chance at the beginning. Now they've got that mixed in with these signings. And Jaden Nelson and some of these players have really shown a success story of the academy as much as anything else, and are now contributing really well in MLS.
For sure, yeah. And for Nelson, it's very surprising, specifically because he's doing it in a role that he's not quite frankly familiar with, because he came through as a winger. There were times when he would fill in at left back, but that was very, very rare. And now he's kind of found his home as this kind of hybrid number 8 or left winger role, if you want to call it that. And he's really formed a nice triangle with Crescito and Insigne. They seem to have a lot of synergy together, and it's making a heck of a lot of difference because Crescito provides the width. Insigne, who likes to drift inside a lot and kind of dictate games in that left half space, gets to do his thing. And then Nelson provides the secondary cover off the ball, as well as that, third part of the triangle whenever they're building up to progress the ball, of course. So it's just a really useful partnership between all three of them. And for Nelson, it's really helping because I think you can definitely give credit to Bob Bradley for giving the younger players a shot up until all the transfer activity this summer, but they weren't really put in a position to succeed because a lot of these players were converted wingers playing at fullback or converted forwards playing in the midfield, what have you. And because they didn't have the spine of their team really implemented, because they were still learning the system, you could see that they just weren't really put in a position to succeed at all. Yeah. Now that everybody's there and you can kind of fill in the gaps with these players, which is technically what you want to do in a salary cap league like MLS, now you're starting to see them bear the fruits of the labor. What that's going to mean for guys like Kosi Thompson going forward, for DeAndre Kerr going forward, and players of that ilk, that's probably the question that we have to ask here. Because Toronto definitely has a very strong academy. They have a lot of talented players, but the big criticism of the club for the last several years is that outside of maybe Jonathan Osorio, Ashton Morgan, and Daniil Henry, none of them have really solidified a consistent starting place in the team. So I guess maybe the hope is that one or two of these players, and that's really all you need at the end of the day, can at least be rotational, if not regular starters in the side. But maybe once Marc-Anthony Kaye gets fully fit again, Nelson ends up being on the outside looking in, but competition's also good. Maybe it'll push both players in the end.
Definitely, and it gives that mix, doesn't it? With Osorio and Marc-Anthony Kaye back with Michael Bradley, there's a different style of centre midfield. You take one of those off and put Jadon Nelson in. It adds a different, more attacking possibly. He's got a lot of pace, quite busy player, quick on the ball. So it gives them options, which I don't think they had too much of at the beginning of the season. And you mentioned Daniil Henry's come in. Hasn't really made a big impact on the first team, but it's a big there's a lot of the Canadian national team players and those who are competing to get into that squad in Qatar have come back to Toronto to really sort of try and cement their place, get themselves some first team football if they can, and that's going to be something that's quite important for the national team as well, knowing that they're within the club and they are trying to get these games.
Definitely, yeah. And especially when you look at Montreal, for example, you've got Joel Waterman and Alistair Johnston playing on the same side. You got Kamal Miller on the left, Samuel Piette in the midfield. Occasionally Ismail Kone comes in. So you've got pieces there that if you choose to call them up, at least they have that familiarity at club level and play in a similar system to the national team. Yeah. So it's a very seamless transition. And it's the same thing with Toronto FC here. Even if Daniil Henry isn't playing all the time, because Lucas McNaughton seems to be the go-to at right center back these days, at least he's in a familiar setting. At least he can occasionally fill in. And I think he's still going to get called up to the World Cup just because he is a veteran on the back line. And in recent performances for Canada, he has done very well. And he is Stephen Vittoria's direct replacement, who really doesn't have a third backup at the moment. So as long as he's contracted to a club and he's playing on occasion, he's shown the ability to be able to kind of fill in on an emergency basis and really not look at all like he's, not a regular starter these days. So I guess that's the good news. And especially for, having Richie Larea come back as well, because he wasn't getting the minutes at Nottingham Forest through various circumstances that he could never have foreseen. I don't even think Forest fans could have foreseen the way things transpired in 2022. But it's good for him now, especially because when you look at Tejon Buchanan, he's recovering from injury. There are a bunch of right-sided players who up until maybe a month ago, you would have put them ahead of Larea in the pecking order. Now you can argue Larea is very much a firm go-to starter for Canada now that he is playing regularly again with Toronto.
Definitely. I spoke with Jaden Nelson recently about his teammates, and he mentioned, I asked him about the fullbacks he's gone up against in training as well as other games, and he just raves about Richie Larea. He's someone who's pushing his teammates further as well, and he's been a real, like, having him and Crescito has added some like real consistency on both the fullback side. With the playoffs coming and the competition for that, how you've mentioned this, that some things they need to improve on. I'd suggest maybe centre back and goalkeeper could be one of these, two of these positions that in the next season they may want to address. But the way they're going at the moment, the way they are attacking, just they're 2 points off the playoffs right now, and they've played an extra game or two compared to some of their rivals. How confident do you think Toronto FC fans can feel about them getting into that playoff spot come the end of the season?
See, this is what's so amazing about MLS is that you can put 1 or 2 wins in a row together and suddenly your fortunes completely change, right? Like I'm sure some of us in the back of our minds were thinking, yeah, if TFC could put a run together, maybe then they could kind of be in the fight for the playoffs, but not necessarily be right in the thick of things. They put 3 wins in a row together, and right away they're right in the thick of it again, right? So obviously when you look at their run in on paper, it is very difficult because you have Montreal on Sunday, which is their second last home game. It's their penultimate home game of the season. Then you have to go to, I believe it's Atlanta away. You've got Miami at home, Philadelphia, as you mentioned, at the end of the season away, and they're probably going to be competing for the Supporters Shield at that time. So there's going to be a lot to play for. A lot of tricky matchups in there, but we probably thought the same thing when they were coming up against Portland, who was, at that stage were unbeaten in, I can't even remember what the run was, but it was something incredible, like 8 or 9, 10 games, maybe unbeaten until they came to BMO Field in mid-August. So you just never know, really, especially when there are so many teams competing for those last 2 or so spots in the East. And traditionally, 45 points or more has been enough to get 6th or 7th in either conference. I feel like it might be a little bit less just because all of these teams fighting and jockeying for position are just taking points off each other. So it might even come down to 42, 43 at that stage.
Yeah. But they lost. They obviously could have been level with Inter Miami, but it was a great last like late finish from Ricky Pooch for LA Galaxy last night, who are chasing playoffs themselves as well. But Toronto looked like they can compete, and they've looked like they're not, at no point are they crumbling towards the end of games. This was something that was very well played. It was very quick reactions. Obviously the free kick from Costa, possibly Bono should have done better with, but it was a very well struck kick. But it's going to be very exciting to see how they get on throughout the rest of their regular season to get in. If we go across to Montreal, they've really capitalized on New York City FC falling away slightly and pushing right up there with Philadelphia Union, and it was a bit of a disappointing defeat to New York Red Bulls last night, which probably means that now their season is preparing for playoffs rather than chasing what was sort of a distant hope of Supporters Shield before that. But they've been in incredible form this year, and despite not reaching the final of the Canadian Championships, they've probably been one of the better teams, the Canadian sides in MLS.
Definitely, and it's probably not even close. And it's so bizarre too, because if you watch their first, I'd say, couple of months of the season, they were a train wreck defensively, especially with the amount of turnovers they would have when building from the back, or just various defensive lapses. Maybe the midfield just happened to just be non-existent. It made you think to yourself, did we maybe overrate Montreal a little bit? Because a lot of pundits in Canada were thinking they're going to make the playoffs. It's just a matter of where are they going to finish in the Eastern Conference. And through the first, I would say 6 to 8 weeks of the season, everybody was kind of looking at each other going, uh-oh, this does not look promising. But you got to keep in mind too, they completely reinvented the back line. They did have a couple of injury issues in the midfield. They embedded Ismail Kone into the side next to Victor Wanyama, and I don't think we can underestimate the impact Wanyama has had on
100%.
Kone's development. I mean, learning from him has to be absolutely instrumental to his growth as a player. But now you got Samuel Piet back in the mix. Mathieu Chaunier has come back into the team recently from injury and done pretty well. Romel Kyoto is having an incredible season up front for Montreal. Kai Kamara is chipping in. Mason Toy's chipping in. Georgia Mihailovic, who's probably an outside shot for MVP, to be honest, just based on how well he has played this season. He's on his way to Europe, of course, come January. It's all really coming together. And if you look at their underlying numbers as well, despite all the defensive mishaps they have had, they're all very strong. They're top 5, top 6 in the league. So it kind of makes you think, if it comes to one-offs in the playoffs, they can probably put a pretty decent run together. The only hesitancy I have with maybe labeling them an MLS Cup contender is teams like New York, Philadelphia, who tend to press from the front and have very sound, organized sides and have a specific way of playing.
Yeah.
They tend to put Montreal under a lot of pressure. And that's when the mistakes do happen, because teams who play vertically and very incisively, with how Montreal's backline tends to, one guy likes to push up and then leave a gap in behind, they can exploit that very quickly.
Yeah.
So that would be the one reservation I have. And we saw that last night with the Red Bulls. Like, they cut them apart on a few occasions. But if Montreal cedes the initiative, they can be very sound defensively. It's just when they tend to start dominating games when you're like, okay, can they be had on the counter?
Yeah, you mentioned obviously Mihailovic off to PSV. He's been a fantastic player. Had his injury period, and Montreal managed to. There was lots of questions. How are they going to cope without him? Such a creative force in the midfield and linking the attack. But they continue to play well, and to get him back and to know he's staying until January, he's not leaving in this transfer window. It's huge for them. Wanyama, like you say, has been incredible. He's a great role model for Kone to help his development. And Kyoto with 15 goals, level with Jesus Ferreira, who people have been raving about, is going to be possibly the US men's national team number 9 going into the World Cup. And Kyoto on 15, level with him, just 5 off the likes of Driussi and Mukhtar. It's been really good how they've managed to adapt how they're attacking and not become reliant on one person. And probably that goes a lot down to what Wilfred Nancy has done as a manager, really, is like the way.
Yeah, 100%. And considering the position he was in when he took over for Thierry Henry, during a COVID-induced season and, having to change a few players around, there were a lot of incoming transfers prior to 2021 as well. He's done exceptionally well to just right the ship, keep it sturdy and just progressing from there. And that's the thing, right? I mean, you mentioned it there, Mike. It's very much an attack by committee, right? Because if Kyoto isn't doing it, Mihailovic does it. If Mihailovic doesn't do it, then you got a Toy or a Kamara doing it. And even guys like Alistair Johnson and Samuel Piet are chipping into the attack. And traditionally, they haven't been those kinds of players, but they've grown in terms of their qualities in the final third, with their crossing, with their progressive passing, with their, shall I say, maybe less fear, kind of meandering into the final third and doing their thing. And that's what you need. That's what you need from a team like Montreal. You need everybody chipping. It can't just be the same 1 or 2 players. And, I did mention off the top where a lot of these teams competing for MLS Cup tend to have those 1 or 2 big name difference makers, or at least big money difference makers. You have those difference makers in Montreal, but then you kind of look at what they're earning and you're like, you know what, this is a very sound, astute, and quite, and I say this very respectfully, but frugal way of building the squad. No. And it's very much helping them.
Oh, 100%. Yeah, it really seems to be. And I guess as we look at them, and you were saying if they can get a lead in a playoff game and sit back and defend and possibly look to counter when necessary, then they're in a very good position to progress well and can compete with most other teams. When we've got to this point though, now with sort of 5 games left, and it's just about maintaining their position more than competing for anything. Is there any concerns about the sort of momentum going into the playoffs, do you think, or are we quite confident of what Montreal are and their consistency on the field?
Yeah, I think it just comes down to the results that they put together leading into the playoffs, because that tends to make the difference for any team, quite frankly. If you come into the playoffs on a serious low, chances are you're probably not going to go far. Like if you look at some of the, top 2-3 teams in each conference over the last few years, the ones who have traditionally done well in the playoffs usually come in at least a decent bit of form. Like I'm not saying they're coming in there, getting 2 points on average per match, but
Yeah,
they're at least not, riding a 4-match winless run, for
yeah,
example. So that's the key here for Montreal. That game Sunday is going to be really important, I think, not just for Toronto, but also for Montreal, because if they can essentially put the nail in the coffin of their fierce rivals' playoff hopes, I feel like that could spur them for the rest of the season, the regular season, that is.
yeah.
And then if they can kind of put the results together, they come into the playoffs confident. And then from there, you just kind of go from there, hoping that they maybe don't run into a New York style team in that first round or two, which it doesn't look like they will, just based on their seeding.
Yeah. Yeah, well, it's very interesting how the Eastern Conference is going to be playing out for the rest of the season, with
Right.
obviously the top 4 sort of pushing away, and second down to 4th could go either way between them, and there could be some movement there throughout the rest of these final weeks, and we'll have to see how Toronto can get on, and if they can push themselves in. We're moving across to the West. Vancouver Whitecaps were the Canadian champions. Was this something that was a bit of an underdog story, would you say, for them to be competing so well in this?
In a way, yeah, just because of the problems they've had with Canadian Premier League sides over the last couple of years, they've just not been able to get it done against them. And it's quite frankly embarrassing. I understand that the CPL is growing and they've put together some really good results in CONCACAF competitions. But at the end of the day, it's a league that's 3 or 4 years old.
Yeah,
And, I think what adds insult to injury is the players who made the difference in the games against Pacific and Cavalry back in 2019 were former Whitecaps players, or at least in the Whitecaps system.
yeah,
So to really drive it home, not only do they lose to CPL sides who, in terms of budgets, the Whitecaps dwarf any CPL side, but they're losing against players that they once had in their systems.
yeah.
So the fact that they obviously had a bit of an easier run than say Toronto or Montreal did because they faced all CPL sides, but you could kind of see the intent they had by naming strong teams for every single one of those games from the start of the competition right up until the final. And kudos to them, because I feel like as a knockout team, like when you get into a knockout setting, the Whitecaps under Sartini, I think, could cause a lot of problems. And very similar to Montreal in that if they can see the initiative and just stay defensively disciplined, they can really cause a lot of problems for teams on the counter. But as we've kind of seen recently, that's not always a guarantee.
Yeah, that's it. They're a side that want to sit deep and counter-attack and defend. But it seems that their defense is possibly one of the weakest points of their squad.
Right.
So they're relying on the weakness to get the best out of their better players. It's quite a strange setup that they've got going at the moment.
Yeah. And especially when you look at some of the players they have let go recently, whether that's on loan or just straight up sold them or just let the contracts run out. A lot of those players could actually make a very big difference on that back line. Derek Cornelius was loaned out to Greece last year, and he has grown exponentially as a defender, both on the ball as well as with his defensive positioning, his anticipation, which were often criticisms of his in Vancouver, and I think part of the reason why he was let go. But right now, they're playing right-footed Jake Nerwinski, a fullback, at left-sided center back pretty much every week. You don't
Yeah.
think a left-footed Derek Cornelius could come in there and be an instant upgrade? I personally think he would be,
Yeah.
and it's not even close. And even guys like Christian Campagna or anybody from the Whitecaps reserves who are doing very well in MLS Next Pro, they could be given a shot for a few games, and you have to imagine they would be upgrades, but they're sent out on loans to the CPL, or they stick with Whitecaps FC2 in MLS Next Pro. I feel like going forward, that is going to help a lot of these younger players, because one of the big issues with the Whitecaps youngsters is, which is why I kind of can't really forgive TFC for this, they haven't had a second team close by. The reserve team hasn't really existed since 2017. Now that it's back and these players are getting meaningful minutes in a structure where it's going to be kind of similar to the first team, that's probably going to help them a lot in terms of getting into the first team picture. But for right now, that really is what's baffling to me, in that they continue to put square pegs in round holes, and it just seems like they can't put any consistency together, because just when you think the Whitecaps are kind of finding their identity and they kind of got it down to a T, they end up losing 3-0 to Nashville at home, or getting blown up by the Galaxy 5-2, which really should have been a lot more that day. It's just completely baffling, and that's a big reason why they're not going to make the playoffs, despite the slow start that they suffered, much like Toronto. The difference is, at least Toronto's put together some semblance of consistency.
Yeah, they seem to have gone out and added relatively well in some areas. Obviously, Gressel's come in, Kubas in the midfield. Very good signings. They've got the likes of Gould, Cavallini, White going forward, which are very good MLS starters, possibly not desired by other playoff sides in place of what they have, but they're still very much up there and good players. But they have that huge, they seem to have a large quantity of players as backups in those areas. And that's something that I think for them, obviously, they're now really going to be planning for next year. And that's got to be something they need to be looking at, is how many of these players do we actually need who can support the attacking midfield role or the wing back role? How do we feel? For me personally, the defense and the goalkeeping situation really does need addressing there before, obviously, with CCL next year.
Exactly. And I think that, to be honest, the goalkeeping specifically is the biggest difference we've seen, obviously, because Maxime Crepeau was top of the league in terms of goals saved above expected, and in terms of just overall shots faced, and just how immense he was. And that was a big reason why the Whitecaps got into the playoffs. Yes, they got some really clinical finishing and outstanding play from Ryan Gauld and Brian White, but there were times when they were still very leaky defensively, and Crepeau bailed them out. Yeah. And if you look at when Cody Cropper was starting regularly, they were getting literally average goalkeeping, and that still made a massive difference. Now they're not really getting that anymore, with Hassall coming back into the picture, with Cropper kind of falling off a cliff towards the end of his run as the number one. And I know it's really unfair to pin everything on the goalkeeper, but when you have such a leaky defense, that extra 1 or 2 saves per game can really make a massive change towards their fortunes. Because suddenly, instead of going down 2-0 with 20 minutes to go, you get a big save, you're still only down 1-0. Maybe you have enough motivation and confidence to get an equalizer, and then who knows, spur on and get a winner. And that's exactly what we saw last year a lot of times when Sartini took over for Dos Santos.
Yeah, having that sort of goalkeeper who provides confidence to the defense as well as sort of leadership behind, which Crepeau did before, raises the game with the other players, doesn't it? And without that, it adds in those sort of nerves, it adds in the concerns, especially if we get late in games, which to Vancouver's credit, they've been very good going forward late in games. But yes. It's something that they're going to have to really manage coming into the off season. And you could see a few more changes possibly coming in towards the end of this regular season, once the playoffs are sort of eventually mathematically wiped out. Maybe some of these players from Whitecaps 2 might be able to come in and play, or some of these players who are more of a reserve player at the time may get a little bit of time that they think actually this player could contribute next season.
Yeah, and I think that should be the plan, to be honest, because you look at some of the players they have, and they're on pretty decently big tickets, at least from a Whitecaps perspective, because we know
Yeah.
they've been one of the lowest spenders in the league. They tend to like to keep it that way. What better way than to save money by bringing in some of your younger players and giving them a chance next season? I would personally love to see that, because a lot of these players are doing very well. Like, I actually was fortunate to watch a couple of Whitecaps FC2 games when I was over there, and you can see there are some players who you can imagine cracking the first team, even if it's just getting on the bench every game and then maybe getting 10, 15 minutes here and there. They definitely have the capabilities of doing that. And especially when you look at the amount of players they have, the areas they need to improve, specifically the defense, they could really do with getting 2 or 3 of those players out the door completely, and then just, pretty much just, I don't want to say wiping out what they have on defense, because they do have some pretty decent pieces there, like Tristan Blackman. I'm talking specifically the center backs, but
Yeah.
Blackman, Jungwirth, those are guys who I think are very serviceable defenders in this league. It's just solving the left-sided center back situation,
Yeah,
and then figuring out, okay, what is our best defense here? Because that is something I think Sartini still, more than a year into the job, still doesn't quite have a firm grasp of.
No. Okay. So obviously there's our 3 Canadian sides in MLS. Can you give a prediction? Could we see one of these sides? Obviously, Toronto are the only side to have won MLS Cup from Canada.
Right.
Could we see them redoing it again this year? Could Montreal get there first? What are your feelings? Do you think it's a little bit too much to dream, or is there that chance?
You know what? 2022 has been very kind to Canadian football, soccer, however you want to label it.
Yeah.
And, I really do feel like there's some strange feeling in my head that Toronto's going to get into the playoffs. They're going to go in a pretty bit, decent bit of a run here. Like, they might win a round and then maybe cause problems in the second round. But I think Montreal has all the capabilities of getting to the final. Whether they can win it at that point, because if they face LAFC or they face Austin, I'm not too sure if they'll be able to completely shut them out. But I do have a feeling that they could actually end up getting to the final and representing the East here, just based on how well they've been playing, how they seem to just have everything together, that everybody knows their role. Even if guys are hurt, someone steps in and just fills in seamlessly. Quite frankly, I feel like they've been proving a lot of us wrong as the weeks go by. This might just be the pinnacle of that.
So it'll be very nice to see. And other sides, I mean, Philly are on a great run of form, but LAFC are falling away a little bit at the moment, having a little bit of troubles. How can they do? But yeah, we'll look forward to seeing seeing the playoffs when they come round. Peter, thanks very much for joining me. Can just remind everyone where they can find you and find more information of your work and anything to plug that I would like to mention.
Yeah, of course. Well, first of all, thank you as well for having me on, Mike. It was a pleasure. Always loved chatting about MLS and its many, many, many peculiarities. But yeah, in terms of my work, you can find me on Sportsnet. You can find me on MLS as well. And, the various podcasts and radio networks that they have on either one of those websites as well. I'm occasionally on there talking about the day's game before or the game coming up, what have you. So if you're into that sort of stuff, then check me out on any of those platforms, as well as Northern Football as well, my podcast that covers the Canadian game from the national teams all the way down to the domestic game as well.
Fantastic. Brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks again. We'll put these in the tweets so everyone knows how to get hold of you as quickly as and get all that information that you're putting out. So thanks again, Peter. Really appreciate it.
Absolutely.
So there we have it. Vancouver, the Canadian champions, look that little bit too far off of a playoff spot come the end of this season. But Toronto, with their Italian signings, the Canadian national team players coming in, look like they're on the charge to get back up into those playoff spots, which are already home of Montreal, up there in second in the Eastern Conference right now, and look in a good position to be getting that home game in the playoffs. And from there, who knows, on one-off games, they have very much got that good team mentality about them. And hopefully we can see from a Canadian point of view another trip north for the MLS Cup come the end of the season. I want to thank Peter Galindo again. Please check out all of his work online and give him a follow for more information on Canadian football, especially going into the World Cup later this year. Hit the subscribe button. It'd be great to get more of you watching. Follow me at Mike Rice 1983 on Twitter for more information on all things MLS. Thanks very much for listening, guys. Take care. Speak to you soon. Bye.